Welcome back to the Cyber Fusion Report. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and today's conversation goes straight at a problem most of the energy sector still isn't comfortable admitting. We built a globally connected, software-driven energy ecosystem on top of infrastructure designed for a completely different threat model. Distributed energy resources are expanding fast. Inverters are everywhere. Global supply chains are getting harder to trust. And the systems we're deploying will still be running 20 years from now, whether they're secure or not. The uncomfortable reality? Attackers are already adapting to this architecture faster than most organizations are securing it. Joining me today are two people who are seeing this transformation from very different but equally critical angles. First, Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of PhishCloud, who has spent his career helping organizations understand and defend against cyber threats that can impact critical operations and industrial environments. And joining us today is Katherine Hutton, Product Manager for Cybersecurity at Fluence, a global leader in energy storage products and services. Katherine focuses on developing cybersecurity capabilities across operational technology and digital products while helping navigate the rapidly evolving threat landscape and regulatory requirements facing critical infrastructure. Prior to Fluence, she held cybersecurity strategy and research roles with organizations like Schneider Electric, the Army Cyber Institute, the United States Secret Service, and Kearney. She also serves on the board of advisors for the Technology Advancement Center and has been an active contributor to several cybersecurity initiatives supporting critical infrastructure and industrial control system security. Together, Terry and Katherine bring perspectives from both the cybersecurity and energy sectors at a time when reliability, resilience, and security of modern energy systems have never been more important. Terry, Katherine, welcome to the show. Let's jump right in. So, Katherine, in the energy sector, as I mentioned in the opening, inverters are everywhere, and they're a real concern. And they're increasingly tied to global supply chains that are not always trusted. For those that may not know, what is an inverter and why are they a cybersecurity concern? Additionally, how big is that inverter risk really? And where do you think the industry is somewhat dangerously complacent today?
That's a great question, Gary. And first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. And Terry, I look forward to our conversation today. So, to answer your question, an inverter is a device that converts DC power into AC power and controls how energy flows into the grid. So, what does that mean if you're not in the energy space? Well, it's effectively the steering wheel, accelerator, and brakes of a modern renewable energy assets. So, think of solar plants, battery systems, and many distributed energy resources depend on inverters to work and to connect to the grid. So, you asked, how does cybersecurity come into play when you think about the whole inverter industry, and why are we kind of hearing about it a little bit more than we have before? Well, modern inverters are remotely managed, often remotely managed. As you said in the beginning, very software driven. They're network connected, frequently updated, and globally manufactured. So you have, all the things you mentioned with supply chain security and software coming into play into our modern grid infrastructure. So, what does that mean again in terms of the cybersecurity impacts? Well, a compromise of an inverter could potentially affect your power output, your voltage regulation, your frequency response when you're talking about batteries, and even your plant availability if you have grid infrastructure that is relying on distributed energy resources. So, again, what's all the hoopla that's driving the concern about inverters when you talk about cybersecurity? Well, there's been a lot of recent attention focused on remote communication capabilities. As I mentioned, a lot of these devices have remote access enabled and then are remotely updated. there has been found undocumented functionality, like a modem or a communication device that might not
Mm,
necessarily be needed for the functionality of that inverter.
mhm.
Supply chain visibility, it's a global supply chain, you know, looking at supply chain security concerns. And if you want to know more about kind of what's this conversation, take time to Google the Reuters article about inverters, as well as more recently, the EU Commission has put a ban on inverters from high risk suppliers. Um, so let's unpack that concern and kind of, again, why is there immediate attention around this? I don't think it's necessarily concern about a single inverter. You mentioned, we're looking at distributed energy resources in full. So the concern is more about thousands of identical devices behaving unexpectedly at the same time and potentially behaving unexpectedly at a bad time where there's stress already on the grid. So the risk is not necessarily one inverter or device problem. It's more about the software issue that's replicated across tens of thousands of inverters that are used to support the integration of the distributed energy resources.
Yeah, Catherine, that's actually a really good, interesting point as far as the critical operation they play in the power grid and where they really sit. From a supply chain perspective, one of the things that I've looked at and been interested in is how are these systems being assessed when they come in to the States, for example? You can look at one and have an example of one, but that doesn't mean that the ones that have come after it haven't been changed. So are there regulations that you've seen that are driving towards doing full assessments on these inverters or having a list of, here's the ones that have been vetted and validated?
Mm.
Or is that something that everybody kind of has to figure out for themselves? At least that's how it used to
So
be. I'm wondering if we're getting any closer.
I'm going to say all of the above. So there's actually a standard in Taiwan that requires third-party validation of inverter firmware before
Mhm.
it's used in the system. The focus and the scope right now of that particular standard is on the PV inverter, so more of the inverters used to support the solar farms. But I could see that as potentially increasing it in scope to include other DER resources like battery energy storage. Because, like you said,
Right,
the hard part is how do you get to the source of truth and and assure that that firmware is authentic? There's no malware in there. And then when you connect a lot of these devices to a larger resource, it's not going to cause issues. I think that's also where there was a recent study that was released just a few weeks ago by Carnegie Mellon that called the Electrotech Stack Moneyball, and it's a great paper. Highly recommend you go read it. But what it did was it looked at, how do we understand this Electrotech stack that is now supporting DERs? We're adding a lot of digital capability to a modern grid infrastructure that was mostly based on like physics managed inertia. So, what do we need to do to take that additional assurance as we have lots of these devices connected to make sure that we can operate securely? And it puts a focus on like the defensive approach, which is more the cybersecurity aspect of, like you said, what are the steps we need to take from that firmware all the way up to kind of the cloud management system. Um, but also, it makes the point that there's also an economic strategy that's a bit different, where it's more of an offensive long term strategy of domestic supply chain. So I
right.
see kind of that those two things are intertwined in a lot of conversations right now, especially at Europe, when they made the proposed update to the Cybersecurity Act. Part of that included an information and communications toolbox to try to provide guidance on around how do you understand a high risk provider. So again, as we're adding more tech into our energy infrastructure, what is the framework we need to take to think about the security from the beginning versus having to chase it later on? Um, and like you said, I think Taiwan has that one standard, but I think that what we're seeing in the US as well as the EU is we probably need to have more of a framework to guide that decision because there's no clear one way to do it right now. So it's very much an evolving conversation.
Totally agree.
So you mentioned DERs, or distributed energy resources, and for years we've discussed these as more of a future exposure, but we're seeing a lot more real world activity around this now. So what has changed here? And are most organizations defending, yesterday's grid, while attackers are targeting this new today infrastructure?
Right. So I think what has changed is scale. 5 years ago, DERs represented just a small percentage of grid operations, and now we're just seeing more of it used, especially in supporting the energy transition, because we're going to have to support the energy load, which means we're going to have to rely on more energy sources to support that. Where we need to figure out how to do that is, okay, well, we can't just add new things onto the grid without making changes for the grid to support that. So if you think about kind of the influx of the hyperscalers and the data centers to support AI, we're seeing some of that response, and I would say pushback, but response from NERC SIP, where they're saying, hey, we've got a warning. We could potentially put kind of unknown loads of energy load onto the grid. We need to make sure we manage that. So perhaps we should look at hyperscalers bringing their own energy so they don't necessarily throw off the grid itself. So again, I think it's scale is the main thing that why we're seeing DERs much more in conversation today.
Hmm.
So one of the things that I've been paying attention to this for a while, just across OT industry in general, but definitely, I think energy and gas were kind of leaders in this. Is while you're introducing risk because you now have digital systems, you also introduce places to gain additional data, right? You now have measurement locations you didn't have before. Telemetry data is coming in from all sorts of different devices. I'm curious if you're seeing very many organizations really recognize that, not just from a security implication of, hey, we can monitor what a regular operation looks like and then look for deviations from that, but from a business perspective, that a lot of times this is the core of the business, right? So I know there's a lot that goes into measurement and looking at the grid and doing load balancing. But do you see companies investing in, things like cyber fusion centers where you can combine IT and OT data to really have a good operational picture as well as security? Is, is that a
Yeah,
place you're seeing people invest?
I'm definitely seeing that come more into focus, especially as again, from the lens of battery energy storage systems. I like to think of them as more living, breathing systems versus wind and solar. Where
Yeah,
wind and solar, you're creating the energy and you're able to add it to the grid or just, stop it. With battery energy storage systems, you can charge and discharge. And so the
yep,
need to really enhance the granularity of the performance to add that efficiency well is definitely a direction that I think the industry is heading. So you can be really precise on your energy load and your energy management. Um, that again, when we talk about the cybersecurity piece, um, we're seeing nation state attackers really looking to learn how systems work down to the
right.
operational level.
Mm.
And so that means that the way these two things combine is for us to be able to really understand what baseline behavior is, what anomaly looks like. That operational clarity also supports, like you said, the cybersecurity team, who is like looking to protect the functioning, the performance, and the efficiency of that asset itself. So I think that if cyber fusion is not a big topic or investment area now, I definitely see that as a really important and critical part of supporting our next energy transition and the future grid.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. So, in this energy grid, you guys are deploying systems that really are designed to live for decades when the threat landscape kind of reinvents itself every 18 to 24 months or so. So, how do you secure something long term without locking in today's assumptions, which are going to be obsolete tomorrow? And I'm going to tack on a little question there for those of us like me who are interested in my power not going out at home. If a attacker is successful in gaining access to these systems, what is the damage that can be caused?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, I think a key word is adaptability. The wrong approach is designing security around today's threat list. Again, especially when you think about battery energy storage system projects, usually have a 20-year project lifecycle. Um, it's probably unlikely that there's going to be no cybersecurity incident within that 20-year life cycle. And so I think approaching it, assuming we're going to have compromise, we're going to have an event, is how you could be adaptable to make sure that you're thinking about modifying the system as needed to address the unknown. And this is where I like to bring in the whole concept of something called cyber-informed engineering, which is a methodology and approach out of the Department of Energy, and really supported by Idaho National Lab. And this is support. I think this approach is very powerful for that whole concept of adaptability. Like you just said, rather than thinking about how do I stop every single attack for the next 20 years, you just assume that you're going to have something happen. And so, what is the physical consequence that you want to avoid? Like, what is the worst bad day that you could have on the physical side? And then understanding, okay, well, how does that cyber digital layer um, connect and cause that physical event to happen? And then cyber informed engineering allows you to understand that kind of controlled proximity between digital to actual kinetic action. And then you can understand, based on where that risk is concentrated in the system, be adaptable to, okay, what are the traditional cybersecurity controls I can put on the digital side to reduce likelihood, but also be adaptable again, we're thinking ahead. And then what are the actual engineering controls I can put to help mitigate the physical consequence that you have? And those two things together are where I think resilience really thrives, because you're not necessarily stopping just at the software piece. Again, you're kind of in this cyber physical world. And so what's the worst that could happen? You could, cause grid instability potentially if fleets are compromised. You could have local damage that would impact maybe a local area. And if the timing and frequency is right in terms of instituting attack on a stressed grid, it could have larger scale kind of public impact. So really thinking about how does cyber-informed engineering help me think about that? And how do I design for a future in which I'm both mitigating any type of physical impact and then reducing that likelihood on the software side?
Yeah, when we were going back in time to when I was doing red teaming, we did assessments against power grids, and one of the interesting things we always found back then is, for example, most of the manufacturers they don't have hashing implemented, so there's no way to there used to not be a way to verify what a software package was or that it was correct. Those are some of the areas that I think organizations can definitely look at is, making sure that the software that you are using, is signed, it's hashed, it's something that you can validate and verify, what it is, what's in there. SBOM started going down the path of really starting to break down those software packages into components and understand, what does this really mean to the organization? Are we introducing, something like Heartbleed that nobody really saw coming, but all of a sudden, you find a vulnerability that's packaged in absolutely everything, right? Those are some of the things that you can look at is, helping to future-proof that means you understand what's coming into the environment and exactly what you're introducing over time. But I think to the actual cyber physical controls that Katherine you're talking about, also making sure that you have that failure option that is a physical component, right? So in other words, even if this system is completely overloaded, something else, a big fuse is going to pop before it causes impact. Now, it still causes an outage, but maybe not as bad a damage, right? So those are the sort of things that, we always recommended when we were working with these organizations is you have to balance those things. I think it's a lot to take on, wouldn't you agree, Catherine? It's not
Yeah,
an
yeah,
easy
and I think
task.
that's a great point in that, you these are cyber physical systems, so they have layers of complex
Yep.
controls. And again, more from the lens of the battery energy storage system, you have digital, you have safety systems, so that having control of the asset doesn't mean you necessarily can cause a consequence, because you do have those fail safes in place that, from a physics standpoint, at some point, the physics will just take over.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was looking at a cartoon today, and in the first frame, it had a guy saying to another guy, "Sell me this pen." You've seen that in different things before. The next frame said, "Every vendor's answer, it's powered by AI," right?
Nice.
And that seems to be what's going on in the industry today, whether they can back that up or not. Well, in this particular space, everyone claims secure by design, but very few vendors can actually prove that. So, from your perspective, what does a real secure by design look like in energy systems? And where are organizations still just checking the box instead of building in real engineering resilience?
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard, Gary, of the trough of disillusionment, but it kind of makes me think like, earlier on, I was kind of riding the whole zero trust marketing wave when that was a
Mm,
newer concept, I guess, being in the marketing world, and came across this. Concept where you have this marketing hype that's the trough of disillusionment, and then you realize, wait, what's actually behind that messaging? Oh, nothing. And so then you have this doubt, and then slowly, the actual intent of, say, zero trust starts to make sense, and then it starts to kind of become part of strategy versus just marketing. So
hmm
I think the security by design can be quite confusing. So what does it actually mean? I don't think it just means adding security features. So it means designing products so unsafe outcomes are difficult or impossible, like we just talked about with cyber informed engineering and energy systems that are cyber physical. I don't know if you've ever heard of Rick Howard's cybersecurity first principle. If you haven't, highly recommend reading the book. But he makes the point that when you're developing your cybersecurity strategy and you're developing your tactics around like what features, controls you're going to have, always go back to the first principle. And what is that first principle? The first principle is this going to help me reduce the likelihood of material impact?
mm,
So if it's not going to help with that, then why don't we reassess? Because then it's not supporting the strategy. So companies who can explain kind of their secure design by design back to that first principle are probably heading in the right direction, because it means that they're already forced to think about, if the security control fails, what protects the mission, what protects that cybersecurity first principle
hmm
that I'm building everything upon. So real security by design, again, isn't about preventing compromise necessarily. It's about preventing catastrophe. And versus most marketing claims, like sometimes zero trust AI, military grade, long feature list, compliance checklist. I think really trying to understand the intent behind that design is where you can start to understand, is that design credible?
hmm
Also, I was in an interesting conversation with another vendor whose whole approach is, why do we need to mitigate risk when we could just eliminate it completely? So I thought that was kind of an interesting approach that now I'm seeing, kind of creativity come in terms of how do we just, you know, block the kill chain completely.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there's definitely some interesting products coming out and, some big claims, right? There are some folks claiming that, hey, I can lock down your network to the point that nothing can happen except for the things you want. Which, that I definitely want to see that, right? The proof's in the pudding. Um, that I think a lot of the time, some of those challenges, though, they try to solve it by locking everything down, which makes it harder for people. and to do their job. And then when it's hard to do the job, they relax it up, and you end up having something that's there, but not necessarily doing what it's supposed to do because you haven't implemented it properly, right? Which I
Yeah.
see quite a bit. There's a lot of vendors in this space, and maybe they get implemented, through the first portion of the project, but a lot of times I see things half implemented out there. So I think that's one of the areas that a lot of organizations really need to focus on is, leverage what you already have, right? There's investments are good, but you have to make sure you're getting the most out of those investments. And that means, going back to the secure engineering, and secure by design,
Hmm.
know how you're going to use it and actually implement it fully, and get the visibility you're intending out of these products, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah,
it's
I
definitely an
agree.
interesting space when you
I
when you're
I
looking at
try
it.
to remind my team, you can't get caught in perfection or over engineering.
Right.
So take a step back and let's not chase perfect alignment to a standard because it might not make sense in our system, based on the intent of what we're trying to reduce from a risk standpoint. So, I think that's a good thing to think about as well.
Well, as you can see by my gray hair, I've been in the cybersecurity business way before cybersecurity was cool. But we always acknowledge two things. One, there was no such thing as a silver bullet. That's a marketing term, unless it's Coors Light. That's the only one I know of that actually exists. Um, the other is there's no such thing as 100% security. It just doesn't exist unless you completely isolate yourself from any kind of connectivity at all. So let's turn our conversation to compliance a bit. And I know there are substantial standards in the US, but those standards begin to differ and become more fragmented and inconsistent as you move to other regions around the globe. So, is global regulatory complexity improving security for these systems or just creating an illusion of security?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, if you told me a few years ago I would be diving deep into global policy and regulation and enjoying it, I probably would have laughed. But I have since become, I really find it fascinating. I think there is improvement because what regulation is doing is it's forcing a business case for investment. And what we're seeing in the EU is that they're actually putting teeth behind the regulation in terms of big fines for companies. And even with the Cyber Resilience Act, you can have senior leadership temporarily removed from their position until the product is met into a compliant state. And so, again, that's really kind of forcing the investment to really stop and think about, okay, I'm building this product, I'm managing this asset. Am I also doing the cybersecurity that's needed to protect it? But as you all know, compliance to regulation is not necessarily mean it's a completely secure asset.
Hmm.
So you still have regulation and compliance kind of setting that floor and not the ceiling. Um, and I think that's probably always going to be the case because just regulation moves at the pace of government, which is not fast. So there's no easy way to keep up with the number of attacks that are happening, the change that we're seeing in terms of the complexity of attacks, but also at the same time, it's easy now to get exploits, as we've seen in the AI world. But I think in general, and a positive is that you're seeing more governments that are taking this seriously. There was a really neat presentation at the S4 event this year that looked at what are emerging markets doing. We hear a lot about the US, we hear about Australia, we hear about Europe, but what about some of the smaller markets? Are
Right.
they just copying and pasting what some of these other markets are doing? And
Hmm.
what the speaker found is actually no, like they're taking the time to understand what makes the most sense for the industry in my country and for the applicability to the market. So I think that's also fascinating. Now, what is that happening with all this positive change and now, interest in trying to provide a common floor for cybersecurity controls? It's definitely bringing challenges with it because these are all evolving independently. So when you sit in the seat of a global, asset owner, a global manufacturing company, how do you balance all of these requirements? Um, in 2024, a group at MIT found that over 150 countries had enacted some form of cybersecurity legislation, creating like over 70 different documents that all were slightly different takes on like common controls. So it creates challenges for how do companies manage this economically, to make sure that they're meeting the requirements, at the same time as they're actually addressing the cybersecurity threat. And another interesting point too, if you think about it, these regulations are more of a defensive stance. They're trying to put in controls that are defensive in nature versus regulation that's directly targeting the whole global market institution of cybercrime and cyber threats. And so again, you're going to have kind of that mismatch of timing. And I think that, the conversation and the difference between regulation and security and addressing risk is important to continue happening to make sure that, those who are on the front lines are not only looking at compliance checklists, but again, kind of back to our earlier conversation, really understanding how we're doing more than that and what we need to appropriately to address that cybersecurity first principle of mitigating impacts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the big areas we've actually talked a lot about is, designing for security, not for compliance. And this goes back again to my red teaming days. I still, I still actively do the red team engagements. There are companies that have spent a lot of money on compliance. They've built out their checklists. They have data lakes. They've done, various types of projects around it. But if they face an actual red team type of assessment where we're using adversarial tactics, those compliance requirements aren't actually allowing them to protect their network, right? Not necessarily getting the visibility they need. Focusing. So for me, I've always said focus on the security aspect of it with compliance as an outcome, right? In other words, what's the minimum bar we need for compliance? You need to track that across everything. And that is one area where I think AI is helping, right? These platforms, your platforms can be built now to fully understand all the compliance frameworks, right? We have resources to help do that mapping. And then it becomes, building the controls that get you to the compliance, but are actually engineered for the security aspect of it. So automated compliance is where I think we really need to go, as these new security products come out. But I've always found it interesting that, as you mentioned, Europe kind of leads the game, right? They're leading the race as far as the requirements and the compliance standards, and they did the same thing for private, for individuals with GDPR, and we still don't have a full framework in the U.S. for those things. We have things we refer to, but it's it's interesting to watch how the world, or how organizations end up focusing on compliance so much, but then they end up having a breach anyways. And that's when a lot of times they start finding ways to solve the problem. Right, is that emergency happens and they realize, oh, we, we really do need to do this stuff.
So Terry, let's drill down on that just a little bit. So a lot of companies say they're building an OT cybersecurity program, right? But when you look closer at it, it's fragmented, it's reactive, and even worse, it's disconnected from actual operations. So what are the biggest failure points you're seeing, and what does a real cyber-informed engineering approach actually require? And then, Katherine, maybe you can comment on this from an energy sector perspective as well.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, and this is an exercise that I haven't seen a lot of organizations do, is understand the tooling you already have in place and the data you have available. Right? A lot of times the focus has been on the tooling or checking the box for, we have identity and access management, and we're working on the network segregation project, and checking these boxes that you need to do for compliance without oftentimes diving into the data you have available to help you make decisions, right? And again, not just security decisions, especially when you're talking about an energy grid or a manufacturing plant or in any kind of operational technology. There's oftentimes a lot of telemetry and a lot of data there that can tell you about your operations. And I think one of the biggest things in just OT in general, it's hard to tell the difference between a cyber attack and like a physical equipment failure, right? A PLC went down or when the cards died. So there's very different workflows that are built into the OT side of the house, the engineers, and the command centers versus the IT side of the house or the SOC, right? The SOC wants to preserve all data, whereas the OT organization, most of the time, their first troubleshooting step is to reboot the device, right? And that they conflict with each other. So you have to have that data that's being gathered in real time through various means to help make those decisions. Was this something that was expected, or should we have expected this? And I always like getting down to, could you have predicted this? Because when you get to the point that you are doing predictive analytics on your operations, now the security side of it starts to actually, you start closing that loop, because you can see and tell what normal operations look like. And as soon as something starts going wrong, then you can actually look at the data that you've gathered to try to determine that. So that's the way I look at it. Is there's a lot that can be done if you take the data first approach. Whereas if you take a compliance first approach, a lot of times you end up falling short because you're not interpreting the signals you already have in front of you. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Katherine. Where do you see the
Yeah,
biggest
I
challenges?
think I don't know if you all have read it or watched the YouTube video from Simon Sinek, and his whole point was start with why.
100%.
So I feel like you have to start with why. Why do we want to have an OT program? What's the point of it? And then you can understand, well, is it because we're managing OT assets? Is it because we're building OT assets? Like, why is the reason that we're doing this? And then to Terry, like your point, I agree. Like, as you kind of understand the question for the need to have this, then, trying to avoid some of those more common failure points of assuming that, this means that it's just the cybersecurity team. No, like you have to connect with operations, engineering, all the stakeholders who are involved, who know the ins and outs of these OT systems. Making it compliance only, again, you're kind of missing, the aspect of the risk aspect, and staying in tune with where you need to have those cybersecurity controls based on the threats. And then another big one is like unclear ownership. And this is where like the cyber fusion concept is fantastic and we should go that direction. But like, again, it's a merging of disciplines and potentially personnel. So how do you develop the right ownership partnership structure to really make sure that your OT program like thrives? And I would say those are all common in whatever industry you're in. So not just energy, but any type of industry that you're really looking at setting up an OT program.
Totally agree.
So we have to wrap this up here. We can't talk all day, but I'll ask this last question to kind of get to where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So, Katherine, where do you see the most dangerous gaps between these digital systems and physical operations? And what should leaders be fixing immediately if they want to avoid being the next headline?
Yeah. Kind of back to our earlier conversation, I think instead of taking the approach of what if, leaders need a question even if. So instead of going, can we stop every attack? Let's change the perspective and say, can we continue safely even when an attack gets through? So back to that cyber-informed engineering concept, the cybersecurity first principle, where you're really thinking about how do I understand where that control lies to
Hmm.
prevent a really bad day in terms of a physical response, especially in the energy space. Um, so for leadership action, I think it's important to realize too that the energy transition, the DER world is fundamentally a digital transformation of our critical infrastructure. So every battery, inverter, and DRE fleet and control system we deploy depends on both capability and cyber exposure at the same time. So
Hmm.
organizations that succeed won't be the ones with the longest compliance checklists, as we've kind of hit on this conversation. It's those that are focusing on the resilience aspect.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, the resiliency is that biggest, I think, biggest concern that I'm seeing right now, and we're still seeing organizations that are trying to get a hold of asset management, right? Which is the most basic step. And whether it's an IT or an OT organization, that's the foundation of being able to build security out for your organization. You got to know what you have and what you're protecting. And a lot of organizations are still struggling with that. So, and it's interesting because as you implement more things like, network segregation, and that's a big push in the industry, right, in several industries right now, is make sure that you have isolated networks depending on what you're doing. That actually makes it even more challenging because now you've got changes that are happening in all these environments. You need to be collecting that in real time to know what your assets look like. But it's definitely a changing, environment. Like we were saying, this industry, or especially the energy industry, doesn't move very quick, right? The regulations are coming up behind it. They move a little faster, right? But still not very quick. But doing things to help secure your environment, um, we always, from a red team perspective, I'm always looking at it as an attacker. Like, what are the easiest ways to approach this? So, I think asset inventory, know what you have, be able to monitor it, and identity and access management that applies across your organization, not just to the IT side of the house, which is where a lot of organizations lose that visibility, right? You've
Hmm.
got different authentication going on in the OT environment, and that's a lot of times not monitored the same as the IT environment. So
Right.
uh, it's definitely there's a lot to do here, Catherine. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat. I'm sure there's a lot more we can chat about in the future, and really appreciate you taking the time to come hang out with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a powerful and very educational conversation. If there's one thing that stands out, it's this: the energy sector isn't dealing with a future problem anymore. It's dealing with a present reality, with infrastructure that wasn't designed for it. And the organizations that win here won't be the ones that pass audits. They'll be the ones that can prove their systems actually hold up under real conditions. That's a very different standard. Terry, Katherine, thank you both for joining and sharing your perspectives. And to everyone watching or listening, if this conversation made you uncomfortable, well, it probably should have. That's where real progress starts. I'm Gary Mullen, and this has been the Cyber Fusion Report.